The Smithsonian has destroyed more history than any war. The warehouse. There is a warehouse in Suitland, Maryland, a suburb of Washington, D.C. that most people have never heard of, that contains more historical artifacts than every museum in Europe combined. It is called the Museum Support Center, and it belongs to the Smithsonian Institution. It holds approximately 55 million objects. The public has seen perhaps 2% of them. This is not a secret. The Smithsonian itself publishes the number. It is presented as a matter of simple logistics. There is only so much gallery space, only so many display cases, only so many hours in a day for curators to catalog and present artifacts to the public. The vast majority of the collection must, regrettably, remain in storage, behind locked doors, in climate-controlled vaults, accessible only to credentialed researchers who submit formal requests through an approval process that can take months and does not guarantee access. You are meant to find this reasonable. You are meant to nod and accept that a publicly funded institution holding 55 million artifacts in the name of the American people is justified in showing you 1 million and keeping the rest in a warehouse in Maryland. You are not meant to ask what is in the other 54 million. The Smithsonian Institution was established in 1846, funded by a bequest from James Smithson, a British chemist who had never visited the United States and who left his entire fortune to a country he had never seen, for the purpose of founding an institution for the increase and diffusion of knowledge among men. This is already strange. Smithson was wealthy, well-connected, and deeply embedded in European scientific circles. He had no personal connection to America, no family there, no business interests. His will specified that the money should go to the United States only if his nephew died without heirs, a contingency that happened to occur, conveniently, at precisely the moment when the American government was beginning to consolidate control over the vast territories it had recently acquired. The bequest was controversial. Congress debated for 8 years whether to accept it. John C. Calhoun argued against it, calling it beneath the dignity of the United States to accept a gift from a foreign individual. Others questioned the motives. Why would a British scientist leave $500,000, an enormous fortune in 1829, to a country he had never visited? The money was accepted. The institution was founded, and almost immediately it became something that its founding document had not described: a gatekeeper, the first secretary. The Smithsonian's first secretary, its chief executive, was Joseph Henry, a physicist of considerable reputation. Henry was a serious scientist, and under his leadership, the Smithsonian focused primarily on scientific research and publication, but Henry's tenure also established a precedent that would define the institution for the next 2 centuries. The Smithsonian would decide what counted as knowledge. Henry was openly hostile to certain categories of inquiry. He dismissed archaeology as a discipline, calling it speculative and unscientific. He had little patience for ethnography. He was particularly skeptical of any findings that suggested the Americas had a history more complex or more ancient than the prevailing academic consensus allowed. Under Henry, the Smithsonian began what would become its defining activity: collecting. Expeditions were funded. Artifacts were gathered from across the continent, and later from across the world. The collections grew rapidly, absorbing material from government surveys, military expeditions, private donations, and the estates of deceased collectors. The material flowed in. Very little flowed out. The Smithsonian collected, cataloged, and then, in many cases, simply held. Artifacts that contradicted the prevailing narrative were cataloged, shelved, and never displayed. Reports that challenged accepted timelines were filed and forgotten. Specimens that didn't fit were placed in storage, where they remain to this day, or don't remain, because the Smithsonian's own records show that significant portions of its early collections have been lost, damaged, destroyed, or simply cannot be located. The institution calls this normal attrition. Every museum loses material over time. Fires, floods, mishandling, clerical errors. Things happen. But at the Smithsonian, things happened with remarkable consistency to a very specific category of artifact. The giant problem. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, American newspapers published hundreds of accounts of unusual skeletal remains discovered across the United States. The accounts described bones of extraordinary size, femurs, skulls, and complete skeletons indicating individuals 7, 8, even 9 feet tall, found in burial mounds, caves, and ancient sites from New York to California. These were not tabloid stories. They were published in papers of record: the New York Times, the Washington Post, scientific journals, reports from county historical societies, state geological surveys, and credentialed researchers. Many of the accounts name specific individuals, doctors, surveyors, professors, who examined the remains and attested to their authenticity. In dozens of these accounts, the same institution appears at the end of the story: the Smithsonian. The remains were sent to the Smithsonian. The Smithsonian dispatched a team to examine the site. The artifacts were collected by Smithsonian representatives, and then nothing. The remains entered the Smithsonian's collections and were never seen again. Researchers who later attempted to locate the specimens were told they could not be found. Catalog numbers led to empty shelves. File references pointed to records that had been lost, misfiled, or destroyed. This pattern has been documented by independent researchers who have spent decades tracing the paper trail. The remains go in, they do not come out. The accession records, where they exist, are incomplete. The specimens themselves are gone. The Smithsonian's official position is that the reports were exaggerated, the measurements were inaccurate, and the remains, to the extent they existed at all, were simply large individuals within the normal range of human variation. The institution does not acknowledge that any genuinely anomalous skeletal material was ever in its possession, but the newspaper accounts are in the archives. The names of the witnesses are on record. The Smithsonian's own correspondence from the period confirms that the specimens were received. They entered the building. They did not come out. This is not a gap in the record. It is a pattern of removal, and it has been operating for over a century. The Bureau. In 1879, the Smithsonian established the Bureau of American Ethnology, a division specifically tasked with studying the indigenous peoples and archaeological sites of the Americas. The Bureau operated for nearly a century, producing thousands of reports, surveys, and publications that form the foundation of American archaeology. The Bureau's founding director was John Wesley Powell, explorer, geologist, and the man who had led the first documented expedition through the Grand Canyon. Powell was brilliant, ambitious, and ideologically committed to a specific narrative that the indigenous peoples of the Americas were primitive, that their cultures had developed in isolation, and that the continent had no history prior to their arrival. This narrative served multiple purposes. Politically, it justified the ongoing dispossession of native lands. If indigenous peoples were primitive and their cultures were young, then European settlement was not conquest, but improvement. Academically, It established a framework within which all American archaeological findings had to be interpreted. Any artifact, any site, any discovery that suggested an older, more advanced, or more complex history was, by definition, anomalous. And anomalies were the Bureau's specialty. It collected them, cataloged them, and filed them away. The Bureau's reports contain fascinating contradictions. Field researchers, the men and women who actually dug in the sites and handled the artifacts, frequently described findings that challenged the official framework. Mound sites that were too complex, too precisely engineered, too vast to be attributed to the populations that the Bureau insisted had built them. Artifacts made of materials not locally available, using techniques not consistent with the assigned culture and time period. Inscriptions in scripts that bore no relationship to any known indigenous language. The field reports describe these findings. The published summaries omit them. The artifacts were sent to the Smithsonian. The sites were filled in. The researchers moved on to the next project, their anomalous findings buried in appendices that no one was encouraged to read. Powell's successor, William Henry Holmes, was even more aggressive in enforcing the narrative. Holmes actively campaigned against any researcher who proposed that human habitation of the Americas was older or more complex than the Bureau's official timeline allowed. He discredited colleagues. He suppressed findings. He used the Bureau's institutional authority to end careers. The Bureau of American Ethnology was not a research organization. It was a narrative enforcement mechanism using the authority of the Smithsonian, the most trusted scientific institution in the United States, to determine not what was true, but what was permitted. The mounds. The mound complexes of the American Midwest and Southeast are the most visible evidence of what was erased. There were, once hundreds of thousands of them, earthen structures ranging from small burial mounds to massive geometric complexes covering hundreds of acres. Cahokia, near present-day St. Louis, was larger than London in 1250 AD. Poverty Point in Louisiana, dating to roughly 1700 BC, is a complex of concentric earthen ridges and mounds that required an estimated 750,000 cubic yards of earth to construct. Moved without wheeled vehicles, without draft animals, by a civilization that the official narrative classifies as semi-nomadic hunter-gatherers. The mounds were the most obvious evidence that the Americas had a monumental past, a civilization or civilizations capable of organized labor on a massive scale, with knowledge of geometry, astronomy, and engineering that did not fit the story of primitive peoples waiting for European enlightenment. In the 19th century, the mounds were the subject of intense public interest. Researchers, amateur archaeologists, and curiosity seekers excavated hundreds of sites, finding artifacts that ranged from the expected to the inexplicable. Copper tools of extraordinary refinement, textiles woven with techniques not known in the pre-Columbian Americas, tablets inscribed with symbols that bore no relationship to known indigenous writing systems, and repeatedly, skeletal remains of unusual size, buried in elaborate tombs with grave goods that suggested a stratified, complex society. The Smithsonian's Bureau of Ethnology was tasked with resolving the mound builder controversy, the public debate over who had built the mounds. The Bureau's conclusion, published in 1894 by Cyrus Thomas, was definitive. The mounds were built by the ancestors of the current indigenous peoples. There was no separate, earlier civilization. No mystery. No anomaly. This conclusion required ignoring a substantial body of evidence. Thomas's report acknowledged that certain artifacts and features were difficult to explain within his framework, but he dismissed them as trade goods, misidentifications, or modern intrusions. The anomalous material was cataloged, sent to the Smithsonian, and shelved. The controversy was declared settled. The mounds were attributed to known peoples. The question was closed. Researchers who continued to investigate alternative hypotheses found their funding withdrawn and their access to sites revoked. And the mounds themselves, the physical evidence, began to disappear. Not through erosion or neglect, but through active destruction. Mounds were leveled for farmland, for road construction, for urban development. Sites that had survived thousands of years were bulldozed in decades. The Smithsonian did not intervene. The Bureau did not object. The most extensive body of archaeological evidence on the North American continent was systematically reduced to a fraction of its original extent, and the institution charged with its preservation watched it happen. The Kennewick Problem. In 1996, a human skeleton was discovered on the banks of the Columbia River near Kennewick, Washington. Initial analysis determined that the remains were approximately 9,000 years old, and that the skull's morphology was not consistent with any modern Native American population. The features were described by the examining anthropologist as most closely resembling Polynesian or Southeast Asian populations. This was a problem. The official narrative held that the Americas were populated by a single migration from Siberia across the Bering Land Bridge. A 9,000-year-old skeleton that didn't look Siberian, that looked, in fact, like it belonged to a different population entirely, threatened the foundation. The Army Corps of Engineers, which controlled the site, attempted to hand the remains to local Native American tribes for reburial under the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. A group of scientists sued to prevent this, arguing that the remains were too old and too morphologically distinct to be claimed by any modern tribal group. The legal battle lasted nearly a decade. During that time, the Corps of Engineers dumped hundreds of tons of fill dirt and vegetation on the discovery site, making further excavation impossible. The Smithsonian was involved in the analysis and the dispute. When the remains were finally studied, after years of legal delays, the Iowa findings were published in a framework that minimized their significance. Kennewick Man was reclassified as Native American based on DNA analysis, and the morphological anomalies were explained as the result of normal variation within ancient populations. The remains were repatriated and reburied in 2017. They can never be studied again. A 9,000-year-old skeleton that didn't match the accepted narrative was returned to the earth permanently after a decade-long institutional effort to prevent its study. The site was destroyed. The evidence was buried, literally, physically buried, and the story moved on. The Missing Collections. In 2004, the Smithsonian's National Museum of Natural History conducted an internal audit of its collections. The results were not widely publicized. The audit found that significant portions of the institution's early archaeological and anthropological collections could not be located. Catalog entries referenced specimens that were not on their designated shelves. Accession records described artifacts that had no corresponding physical objects. Storage areas that should have contained specific collections were empty or contained different material than the records indicated. The Smithsonian attributed the discrepancies to decades of imperfect record-keeping, institutional reorganizations, and the normal challenges of managing a collection of 55 million objects. This explanation was accepted. No further investigation was conducted. But the pattern of what was missing was not random. The gaps were concentrated in the earliest collections. The material gathered in the 19th century by the Bureau of Ethnology and its predecessors, the material from the mound surveys, the skeletal collections from the anomalous sites, the artifacts that field researchers had flagged as inconsistent with the prevailing narrative, the routine material, the pottery shards, the common tools, the unremarkable specimens that confirmed the standard timeline was all present and accounted for. What was missing was the material that didn't fit. Selective incompetence is indistinguishable from deliberate destruction, unless you notice that the incompetence always affects the same category of evidence. Losing 1,000 artifacts is carelessness. Losing 1,000 artifacts that all contradict the same narrative is something else. The present tense. The Smithsonian today is the largest museum and research complex in the world. It operates 19 museums, 9 research centers, and a zoo. Its annual budget exceeds $1 billion. It employs over 6,000 people. It is the most trusted cultural institution in the United States. It also controls what Americans are permitted to know about their past. This is not a conspiracy theory. It is a structural observation. The Smithsonian determines which artifacts are displayed and which are stored, which research is funded and which is not, which narratives are presented to the 25 million people who visit its museums each year, and which narratives are confined to storage facilities in Suitland, Maryland. The institution does not need to actively suppress information. It merely needs to decide what is important and what is not, what deserves a display case and what deserves a shelf in a warehouse. The artifacts it chooses not to display are not destroyed. They are simply made invisible. They exist in a limbo of institutional silence, present in the collection but absent from the public's awareness, technically accessible but practically unreachable. And the invisible artifacts, the ones in the warehouse, the ones with incomplete records, the ones on shelves that don't match their catalog entries, the ones that simply cannot be found, tell a story that the visible collection does not. They tell the story of a continent with a history far older, far more complex, and far more unsettling than the one presented in the galleries. Upstairs, a history of civilizations that built on a monumental scale, that worked in materials and techniques that do not fit the approved timeline, that left behind remains that suggest a population physically different from the one the narrative allows. The Smithsonian has not destroyed this history. It has done something more effective. It has collected it, cataloged it, and locked it in a warehouse, preserving it perfectly while ensuring that no one ever sees it. The building in Suitland is climate controlled. The artifacts are safe. They will last for centuries. And they will sit there, in the dark, behind locked doors, in a building that most Americans don't know exists, holding answers to questions that the institution has spent 178 years ensuring no one thinks to ask. This is a work of fiction and speculative storytelling. The Smithsonian Institution, the Bureau of American Ethnology, Kennewick Man, and the mound complexes of North America are real historical subjects. The Smithsonian does hold approximately 155 million objects, most of which are in storage, a common practice at major museums worldwide. However, the suggestion that the Smithsonian systematically suppresses or destroys evidence of a hidden ancient civilization is not supported by mainstream archaeological or historical evidence. The institution's collections management challenges are well documented and consistent with the logistical realities of operating the world's largest museum complex.